When I wired $47,000 for my son's wedding, he called and told me not to come to the rehearsal dinner because it was for immediate family only. A week later, he called demanding honeymoon money, asking if I had transferred it yet. I simply replied that he would receive exactly what he had earned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is James. I am 70 years old, and what I am about to tell you changed my entire understanding of blood respect and loyalty. I stood in the quiet solitude of my modest kitchen, staring down at the crisp bank confirmation, resting on the laminate counter. $47,000. It was a staggering amount of money wired just an hour ago to secure the exclusive waterfront estate for my son Jordan and his fiancée Emily. The ink on the printout felt heavy, a tangible representation of a father's ultimate gift. The silence of the morning shattered when my phone buzzed violently against the counter. Jordan's name flashed across the screen. I picked it up expecting the frantic excitement of a groom tying up loose ends, or perhaps a rare moment of gratitude for the massive financial transfer. Instead, his voice came through sharp, clipped, and completely devoid of warmth. He did not bother with a greeting. He jumped straight into logistics with the cold efficiency of a corporate manager addressing a subordinate. He informed me that the rehearsal dinner scheduled for that evening had undergone a sudden change of plans. Emily's parents, Robert and Victoria, had apparently upgraded the reservation to an intimate private dining room at their exclusive country club. Jordan cleared his throat, a nervous habit he developed whenever he was about to deliver an insult disguised as a necessity. He told me that the room had a strict capacity limit. He then stated with an agonizingly casual tone that Victoria wanted to keep the dinner restricted to immediate family only. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the hollow echo of his words. Immediate family. I was his father. My wife passed away over a decade ago, leaving Jordan as the only blood relative I had left in this world. Jordan quickly added that it was nothing personal. He suggested my presence might disrupt the formal aesthetic Victoria had curated for the evening, mentioning that my style was a bit too rough around the edges for the elite country club crowd. He wanted the night to be seamless for Emily, and my attendance, according to him, would simply complicate the high society social dynamics. He waited for my anger. He braced for the inevitable explosion of an insulted father who had just financed the very wedding he was being pushed to the margins of. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or remind him of the staggering sum I had just transferred from my life savings to ensure his perfect day. I simply told him I understood perfectly, wished him a good evening, and ended the call. The silence rushed back into the kitchen, thicker and colder than before. I set the phone face down on the counter and picked up my ceramic coffee mug. I turned on the faucet and began to wash the mug, watching the warm water cascade over my hands. I looked down at those hands. They were heavily calloused, scarred, and permanently worn by 40 years of relentless, brutal labor. I did not inherit wealth. As a young black man with nothing but grit, I built a multi-state freight company, starting with a single rusting truck I bought at a government auction. I drove through the night, slept in freezing cabs, hauled heavy cargo, and missed countless holidays to ensure the company grew into an empire. I did it all for Jordan. When my late wife warned me that giving him everything would blind him to the value of hard work, I stubbornly brushed her off. I paid his tuition at an elite university so he would never have to grip a heavy steering wheel or scrub thick engine grease from under his fingernails. I wanted to buy him a life of absolute privilege. Looking at the dark coffee swirling down the drain, I realized my wife had been absolutely right. I had succeeded in shielding him from hardship, but in doing so, I had inadvertently purchased my own son's unyielding arrogance. He viewed my calloused hands not as the strong foundation of his luxurious lifestyle, but as a social liability. He perceived my quiet, modest demeanor not as wisdom, but as an embarrassing lack of refinement. I dried my hands on a cotton dish towel, feeling a profound shift deep within my chest. The sharp pain of his rejection quickly solidified into an icy, calculating resolve. Anger is a useless emotion when dealing with profound entitlement. Action is the only language the entitled truly understand. I walked back to the kitchen counter to file the wire transfer receipt into my locked cabinet, preparing to quietly accept my banishment from his dinner. As I picked up the paper, a specific string of numbers caught my attention and stopped me in my tracks. I have spent 4 decades managing massive shipping invoices, auditing complex logistics manifests, and tracking international financial transactions. My brain is hardwired to instantly recognize corporate routing structures. The account number listed on the bank confirmation did not match the typical format of a hospitality venue, a catering company, or an event management trust. It was explicitly structured like a commercial holding account. I pulled out my reading glasses and scrutinized the recipient details. The beneficiary was listed under a vague corporate acronym, not the name of the waterfront luxury estate where the ceremony was supposedly taking place. Jordan had provided these precise wiring instructions himself, claiming it was the venue's parent company. A cold, sharp suspicion crept into my mind, demanding immediate answers. I carried the receipt into my home office and opened my laptop. I logged into my secured commercial banking portal, a heavy-duty system equipped with advanced tracing tools I regularly use to vet potential freight contractors. I entered the routing and account numbers from the receipt and initiated a deep background trace on the beneficiary institution. The search engine hummed for a few tense seconds before generating a comprehensive corporate registry report. I stared at the bright screen, my jaw tightening, as the truth materialized in stark black text. The $47,000 had not been routed to any wedding vendor caterer or estate manager. The funds had been deposited directly into a private commercial holding account, registered to a completely different corporate entity. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the name of the primary executive officer listed on the official corporate charter. The account belonged to Robert Emily's father. Jordan had not asked me to pay for his wedding venue. He had deliberately directed my money straight into the personal accounts of his wealthy elitist father-in-law. My son had blatantly lied to me using the elaborate guise of a wedding expense to secretly funnel my hard-earned wealth to the very family that had just explicitly barred me from their rehearsal dinner. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark as a new war began. The day of the wedding arrived with a crisp breeze that did nothing to cool the simmering heat inside my chest. I drove myself to the sprawling waterfront estate. I wore a tailored charcoal suit I had purchased a decade ago for an industry gala. It was impeccably cut from fine wool and completely devoid of flashy designer labels. True wealth whispers while new money screams. Walking into the grand foyer of the estate, I immediately heard the screaming. Robert and Victoria held court by the entrance. They greeted arriving guests with booming voices and exaggerated embraces. They behaved as if they owned the very marble beneath our feet. I approached the receiving line to offer my congratulations. Robert offered me a brief, clammy handshake. Victoria bestowed a tight, superficial smile before immediately turning her attention to a local politician who had just walked through the brass doors. Jordan stood nearby in a custom velvet tuxedo. He barely met my eyes. He muttered a quick note of thanks for coming, before signaling a hostess to usher me toward the reception hall. I followed the hostess through the magnificent dining room. We bypassed the tables adorned with towering floral centerpieces and crystal glassware. I found my assigned seat at table 19. It was wedged into a dark corner directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. The frantic shouts of the waitstaff and the harsh clatter of industrial dishwashers provided the soundtrack for my evening. I was seated with distant cousins of the bride who clearly had no idea who I was. The seating arrangement was a deliberate message. I was the financial engine of this entire spectacle, yet I was treated as an embarrassing afterthought. I did not complain to the management. I did not pull Jordan aside to demand a better table. I simply pulled out my chair and sat down. I smoothed my linen napkin over my lap and watched the room. A man who built a logistics empire from the ground up knows exactly how to read a dynamic environment. I sat in the shadows and let the bright lights reveal exactly who I was dealing with. From my vantage point by the kitchen doors, I had a perfect view of the head table. Robert dominated the room. He walked from table to table with a thick silver money clip in his hand. I watched him tip the bartenders and serving staff with crisp $100 bills. He laughed loudly, ensuring everyone in his immediate radius witnessed his immense generosity. Victoria sat beside her daughter, draped in heavy silk fabrics and glittering stones. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the chandelier light with absolute perfection. To the untrained eye, they were the epitome of high society. But 40 years in the commercial freight business teaches a man to look past the fresh coat of paint and check the actual engine block. I watched Robert walk past my table heading toward the outdoor terrace. He moved with an exaggerated swagger, but as he stepped into the light, I looked down at his feet. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine on the top leather, but the soles were completely worn through. The leather was cracking at the stress seams, and the heel block was heavily eroded on the outer edge. A man with genuine wealth does not walk around in shoes that desperately need a cobbler. A few minutes later, Victoria passed by on her way to the powder room. She stopped near my table to adjust the hem of her dress. I noticed her constantly fiddling with her left wrist. The diamond tennis bracelet she wore so proudly had a faulty, cheap clasp. It kept slipping open, requiring her to pinch it closed with a frustrated, angry grimace. Real diamonds of that size are secured with double locking mechanisms crafted by master jewelers. The clasp on her wrist was flimsy base metal holding together cubic zirconia. The puzzle pieces rapidly clicked into place in my mind. The $100 tips were a desperate smokescreen. The worn shoes and the fake diamonds were the reality. They were drowning. They were projecting a lifestyle they could no longer afford, holding up a theatrical backdrop with trembling hands. My $47,000 had not just paid for a wedding venue. It had bought them another month of pretending to be rich. The realization settled over me like a heavy iron blanket. The reception dragged into the late hours. The music grew louder, and the guests grew more intoxicated. I stood up from table 19 and navigated the crowded floor to find a quiet space. I walked down a long, dimly lit corridor leading toward the restrooms. As I turned the corner, the sound of a heated, frantic argument stopped me in my tracks. I stepped back into the shadow of a large, decorative marble pillar. Jordan and Robert stood near the heavy emergency exit door. Their voices were low but laced with panic. Robert had my son pinned against the wall with a desperate, aggressive posture. Robert hissed that the second installment was late. He grabbed Jordan by the lapels of his velvet tuxedo. He stated clearly that the corporate auditors were closing in on his holding company. He warned Jordan that if the accounts were not balanced by the end of the month, the federal investigators would seize everything they owned. Jordan raised his hands defensively. His face was pale and covered in sweat. He begged Robert to lower his voice and remain calm. Jordan promised he had everything completely under control. He swore to his father-in-law that he would secure the rest of the money from my retirement accounts before the month was over. He said the legal paperwork was almost finalized, and once he had full authorization, the funds would be wired directly to Robert's offshore accounts. Robert released his grip and warned Jordan not to fail him before walking away back toward the loud party. Jordan leaned against the door, breathing heavily. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and plastered his arrogant smile back onto his face. I remained perfectly still in the shadows. I did not step forward to strike my son. I let him walk back to his bride. I survived the agonizing humiliation of the wedding dinner. I walked out to my car in the cool night air. The parameters of the war had shifted. They were not just stealing $47,000. They were actively executing a timeline to drain every single cent I had earned over my entire lifetime. Exactly 1 week passed since the night of the wedding reception. I spent those 7 days operating my logistics firm with my usual precision during the daylight hours, while quietly analyzing my personal financial architecture at night. I needed to understand exactly how Jordan and Robert planned to drain my retirement accounts. The answer arrived before I even had to look for it. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a quarterly freight manifest when my mobile phone shattered the morning silence. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I answered the call and was immediately met with the chaotic background noise of a busy airport terminal. Jordan did not offer a greeting. He spoke in a rapid, frantic tone laced with severe irritation. He demanded to know why I had not initiated the backup transfer. I asked him to calm down and explain exactly what he was talking about. Jordan let out a sharp, frustrated exhale. He informed me that he and Emily were standing at the international ticketing counter, preparing to board their honeymoon flight to Greece. He claimed a sudden banking error had completely frozen his primary checking accounts and locked his credit cards. The airline was demanding an immediate payment for their first-class upgrades, and their luxury resort in Santorini required a substantial deposit hold before they boarded the plane. Jordan demanded $15,000. He spoke not as a son asking his father for a massive financial rescue, but as a demanding executive berating a subordinate for missing a deadline. He insisted I wire the money instantly to a secondary travel account. I listened to his panicked breathing. A man who has nothing to hide does not panic over a simple banking error. A bank error can be resolved with a phone call to a branch manager. True panic only sets in when the money was never there to begin with. I did not confront him about the argument I had overheard at the wedding reception. I maintained a measured, calm demeanor. I told Jordan I would log into my secondary banking portal and transfer a small emergency sum to cover their immediate travel inconveniences. Jordan scoffed at the word small. He reiterated that $15,000 was the absolute minimum required to salvage his honeymoon. He ordered me to expedite the wire transfer and hung up the phone without waiting for my response. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the table. The sheer audacity of his demand confirmed everything I had heard outside the reception hall restrooms. He was financially desperate. I opened my secure laptop to process a minor transfer, just to keep him placated while I continued my investigation. I navigated to my secure banking portal and entered my encryption credentials. I intended to move a few $100s from a low-yield personal savings fund, just to keep Jordan moving toward Greece while I fortified my primary assets. I clicked the routing tab for my secondary portfolio. The screen refreshed and displayed a bright red error message. My account balance was exactly zero. I stared at the digital display. I did not feel the sudden rush of blind panic that an ordinary man might experience upon seeing an empty bank account. I felt a sudden sharp clarity. 40 years of navigating the cutthroat logistics industry had conditioned me to respond to theft, not with emotion, but with immediate forensic action. I bypassed the standard user interface and accessed the deep activity logs. I scrolled through the transaction history for the past 14 days. A massive unauthorized structural change had occurred exactly 3 days before the wedding. My secondary savings account had not simply been drained. It had been systematically dismantled and integrated into an entirely new financial ecosystem. Someone had submitted formal electronic authorization to link my primary commercial credit line to a brand new joint account registered exclusively under my son's name. I clicked on the digital signature verification file attached to the linkage request. A flawless reproduction of my own handwriting filled the screen. Jordan had forged my signature. He had used his intimate knowledge of my personal details and my banking schedule to bypass the standard security protocols. He had effectively created a massive invisible siphon attached directly to the financial lifeblood of my logistics company. He did not merely steal the cash sitting in my secondary savings fund. He had granted himself unrestricted access to the vast commercial credit limits I used to maintain my fleet of freight trucks. The frozen credit cards at the airport were not an accidental bank error. They were the direct result of a fraud prevention algorithm, temporarily halting international activity on a newly established and highly suspicious joint account. Jordan was stuck at the airport because he was attempting to finance a lavish European honeymoon using stolen corporate funds that triggered a security lockdown. My son had crossed the line from entitled arrogance to deliberate federal wire fraud. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen and processed the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. The boy I had protected from every hardship had weaponized that very protection against me. He believed my age made me an easy target. I dug deeper into the joint account activity to understand the full scope of his operation. The honeymoon expenses were merely a symptom of a much larger infection. I pulled up the pending transaction queue. A colossal withdrawal was waiting for final clearance. Jordan had initiated a wire transfer for $300,000 designated as a down payment for a luxury townhouse located in the city's most exclusive district. The destination title company was waiting for the funds to clear by the end of the business day. He was not just stealing a vacation. He was using my commercial credit line to purchase high-end real estate to secure his place in his new father-in-law's elite social circle. He needed the $15,000 for the airport because the massive real estate transfer had drained the available liquid cash and tripped the bank's internal security parameters. He called me to bail him out of a crisis he created while actively trying to steal my entire livelihood. The audacity was breathtaking. I did not call him back to demand an explanation or hurl insults. I immediately locked my computer terminal. I disconnected my laptop from the home network and slid it into my leather briefcase. I walked to the hallway closet and grabbed my heavy wool coat. I did not drive to the local neighborhood branch where I occasionally deposited small checks. I drove my car directly to the towering glass and steel skyscraper that served as the regional headquarters for my commercial banking institution. I needed to speak with the highest authority available. The drive downtown was entirely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I used the time to mentally map out my strategy. The conflict was no longer about a disrespectful rehearsal dinner or a lavish wedding built on a foundation of lies. I had discovered exactly why Jordan needed cash and exactly how far he was willing to go to get it. My son had committed severe federal wire fraud to buy a luxury house to impress a family that despised me. He had forged documents to breach the corporate walls of my logistics empire. He had declared war on the very hand that fed him his entire life. I parked my car in the executive garage beneath the bank headquarters. I walked toward the private elevator banks reserved for high-net-worth commercial clients. The game had escalated from simple disrespect to criminal theft. It was time to shut down the accounts and force the thieves into the blinding light of reality. I stepped out of the brass elevator onto the 42nd floor of the commercial banking headquarters. The executive suite was a sanctuary of hushed voices, thick carpets, and panoramic views of the city skyline. I did not stop at the polished reception desk to announce myself. I walked directly past the bewildered assistants and pushed open the heavy oak door to Arthur Kaplan's private office. Kaplan had been my wealth manager for more than 2 decades. He was a man who understood the precise value of a dollar and the brutal physical sacrifice required to earn it. We had weathered market crashes and fuel crises together while expanding my logistics fleet across multiple state lines. He looked up from his dual monitors with a genuine smile of greeting, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He assumed my unannounced arrival was a mere formality. He stood up and extended his hand, stating how pleased he was that I had come down to finalize the joint account authorizations Jordan had submitted that morning. I did not shake his hand. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, ensuring the brass lock clicked firmly into place. I walked to his desk and instructed him to immediately halt any pending transfers associated with my primary commercial credit lines. Kaplan lowered his hand, his professional smile faltering as he registered the absolute coldness in my voice. He quickly tapped his keyboard to freeze the outgoing wire request for the $300,000 townhouse down payment. He looked at me with deep confusion, explaining that Jordan had explicitly stated I was fully aware of the corporate restructuring. Jordan had told him the new joint account was the first phase of my impending retirement strategy. The sheer volume of my son's lies was staggering. He had used the exact corporate vocabulary he learned at his expensive university to bypass the very security measures his education had been funded by. I placed both of my hands flat on Kaplan's glass desk. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute gravity of my tone commanded the room. I demanded to see every single piece of physical paperwork Jordan had submitted to the bank to authorize this unprecedented access to my life savings. Kaplan swallowed hard, sensing the immense legal and personal danger unfolding in his office. He did not ask any further questions. He turned to his secure filing cabinet, unlocked a heavy steel drawer, and retrieved a thick manila envelope bearing my corporate seal. Kaplan slid the thick legal packet across the pristine glass surface of his desk. I picked up the stack of papers, my eyes scanning the top page. It was not a standard corporate succession document or a simple joint account application. The header across the heavy bonded paper read, "Medical power of attorney." My breath hitched in my chest. The document legally designated my son Jordan as my absolute and sole legal guardian. The legal phrasing stripped me of every right to manage my personal finances, my business assets, and my own medical decisions. It transferred the entire weight of my 40-year logistics empire directly into Jordan's reckless hands. I turned the page, searching for the justification for such an extreme legal maneuver. Attached to the power of attorney was a formal medical evaluation. It was printed on heavy, expensive stationery from a private neurological clinic located in the wealthiest district of the city. The diagnostic summary was a masterpiece of fabricated ruin. It stated that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. The medical report claimed I had recently experienced profound memory loss, a total lack of spatial awareness, and a complete inability to manage basic logistical tasks. The document painted a tragic portrait of a once brilliant businessman who had tragically lost his mind. I stood perfectly still, reading the clinical descriptions of my supposed mental decay. Jordan was not merely trying to steal my money. He was systematically constructing a legal cage designed to lock me away from society. If this document was fully executed and filed with the state court, I would lose the right to hire a lawyer, manage my own health care, or even choose where I lived. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever suffered on the loading docks. I had spent my entire life shielding Jordan from the harsh realities of the world. I had broken my back lifting cargo so he could hold a pen in an air-conditioned office. Now he was using that very pen to rewrite my reality and legally erase my existence. The sheer malice required to sit in a room and fabricate a mental illness for your own father was beyond my comprehension. I felt a terrifying, unfamiliar coldness settle into my bones. The love I held for the boy I raised was instantly replaced by the tactical calculation of a man preparing for total war. I flipped to the final page of the medical evaluation to locate the source of this profound medical deception. The signature at the bottom of the diagnostic report belonged to a Dr. William Evans. I stared at the bold, sweeping signature in absolute disbelief. I had never met a Dr. Evans in my entire life. My personal physician was a trusted family friend who had monitored my excellent health for over 15 years. Jordan had clearly bypassed my actual medical team to secure a fraudulent diagnosis from a corrupt private practitioner. The evaluation detailed fabricated incidents of violent outbursts and profound financial incompetence. It claimed I had recently attempted to sabotage my own company, making Jordan's immediate intervention a matter of urgent corporate survival. The level of detail in the fake symptoms indicated a coordinated, highly premeditated legal assault. This was not a desperate spur-of-the-moment theft to cover a honeymoon. This was a long-term strategy to seize my entire estate and banish me to a locked memory care ward. I placed the documents back onto the glass desk and looked at Kaplan. His face had drained of all color as he realized the magnitude of the fraud that had nearly occurred under his supervision. I instructed him to permanently reject the power of attorney and lock every single account bearing my name behind maximum security protocols. He scrambled to his keyboard rapidly, voiding Jordan's access credentials and severing the joint account completely. The $300,000 withdrawal was officially canceled. I told Kaplan to make a certified copy of the entire medical packet for my records. I folded the copies into my inner jacket pocket, feeling the weight of the paper against my chest. The immediate financial bleed was contained, but the larger threat remained entirely active. Jordan possessed the original fraudulent medical dossier. He could easily take those documents to a corrupt judge and file an emergency guardianship petition behind my back. The moment a judge signed that order, my assets would be frozen, and the police would arrive to escort me to an assisted living facility. My survival now depended on destroying the credibility of that specific medical report before Jordan could deploy it in a court of law. I turned and walked out of the bank with singular focus. The time for sorrow had passed. I needed ironclad, undeniable proof of my sanity, and I needed it before the sun went down. I walked out of the towering glass structure of the bank and stepped into the blinding afternoon sunlight. The heavy traffic of the downtown financial district roared around me. Most men in my position would have let rage dictate their next move. They would have stormed over to Jordan's new luxury townhouse, kicked down the freshly painted front door, and demanded an explanation for the treason. But 40 years of navigating ruthless corporate logistics had taught me that pure anger is utterly useless against a stack of notarized legal documents. Jordan had not attacked me with emotion. He had attacked me with paper ink and the formidable weight of the legal system. To defeat him, I had to dismantle the very foundation of his strategy. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and placed the copied fraudulent medical dossier on the passenger seat. I did not waste a single second staring at the forged signature of Dr. Evans. I started the engine and merged onto the interstate highway, heading straight toward the medical district. Jordan had built his entire offensive on the premise that I was a declining, incompetent old man, incapable of managing my own affairs. I needed to obliterate that narrative before he could present it to a judge. I drove past the local community hospitals and standard clinics. I needed a medical authority so absolute and unassailable that no family court judge would ever dare question it. I pulled into the sprawling campus of the state's leading neurological research institute. This facility was internationally renowned for its pioneering work in cognitive science and neurodegenerative diseases. A diagnosis from their chief staff was considered the absolute gold standard in any courtroom. I parked my car and gathered my briefcase. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main pavilion. I was not there to schedule a routine physical or complain about joint pain. I marched directly to the primary reception desk and bypassed the standard triage protocols. I told the senior administrator that I required an immediate, comprehensive, and legally binding cognitive evaluation. I did not ask for their availability. I simply placed my platinum commercial credit card on the marble counter and stated that I was prepared to pay their highest premium out of pocket for an expedited emergency assessment. The sheer force of my demand, coupled with the immediate clearance of an exorbitant out-of-pocket fee, bypassed their usual waiting lists. Within 20 minutes, I was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit examination wing. I was introduced to a panel of 3 senior neurologists, led by the Institute's chief diagnostic director. I handed the chief director the fraudulent medical evaluation Jordan had submitted to the bank. I instructed him to review the fake symptoms carefully, and then subject me to the most punishing cognitive gauntlet his facility had to offer. For the next 4 grueling hours, I was systematically stripped down to my psychological and neurological foundations. They placed me in advanced imaging machines to map the physical structures and neural pathways of my brain. I sat in a barren examination room, while clinical psychologists bombarded me with complex logic puzzles, advanced spatial reasoning tests, and deep memory retention assessments. They asked me to recall intricate sequences of numbers backward and forward. They demanded I analyze abstract visual patterns under extreme time constraints. They pushed my mind to the absolute limit, attempting to find a single fracture or delay in my cognitive processing. I approached every single question with the same brutal focus I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar shipping contracts. I articulated complex historical details and solved advanced logistical scenarios without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I did not show an ounce of fatigue or frustration. When the final psychological profiling segment concluded, the panel of doctors left the room to deliberate and compile their findings. I sat alone in the quiet clinic, staring at the blank white wall, feeling a profound sense of triumph beneath the exhaustion. When the chief director finally returned, his expression was a mixture of absolute professional certainty and deep respect. He did not mince his words. He informed me that my cognitive function was not merely normal for a man of 70 years. It was exceptionally sharp, rivaling the mental acuity of top-tier executives half my age. He stated categorically that the fraudulent document Jordan possessed was a complete medical impossibility. The chief director then handed me a thick, heavy dossier bound in official institute leather. It contained the certified notarized results of my evaluation, explicitly stating my absolute mental competence and financial capability. The document was signed by 3 senior neurologists and stamped with the institute's unassailable corporate seal. I held the heavy folder in my hands, feeling its solid weight. Jordan's legal cage had just been permanently shattered. I walked out of the Neurological Institute as the sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete. The certified dossier was tucked safely inside my leather briefcase, a perfect shield against any court order my son might attempt to file. I had successfully neutralized Jordan's medical trap, but a vital question still lingered in my mind. Why was Jordan risking federal wire fraud and severe criminal charges to buy a house and fund a honeymoon? The sheer scale of his desperation did not align with a simple desire for luxury. As I approached my car, my mobile phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller identification displayed the name of my private attorney, Thomas. Thomas was a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who handled all my corporate acquisitions and trust management. I had texted him earlier from the bank instructing him to launch a discreet total financial background check on Emily's family. I answered the call and sat in the driver's seat. Thomas did not waste time with pleasantries. He dove straight into the financial wreckage he had uncovered. His voice was sharp and filled with a grim satisfaction. He informed me that the illusion of immense wealth Robert and Victoria projected at the wedding was nothing more than a hollow theatrical performance. Thomas revealed that Robert's primary commercial holding company was completely insolvent. According to the deep financial records Thomas had pulled, Robert had secretly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection just 3 weeks before the wedding. He was drowning in massive corporate debt, facing unpaid vendor liens, and struggling against aggressive federal tax audits. The lavish wedding, the $100 tips, and the country club rehearsal dinner were all financed on vapor and desperate credit extensions. But Thomas delivered the final, most devastating piece of intelligence. He stated that the bank holding the primary mortgage on Robert's corporate headquarters had officially initiated foreclosure proceedings due to consecutive months of non-payment. Robert was not just losing his business, he was losing his physical base of operations. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with absolute clarity. The $47,000 Jordan had wired to Robert was not for a wedding venue. It was a desperate attempt to hold off a corporate tax lien. Jordan was stealing my commercial credit to buy a townhouse because Robert was on the verge of losing everything, and Jordan was desperately trying to secure his place in a sinking ship by paying their debts. The fake diamonds, the worn shoes, the argument near the restrooms all made perfect sense. Robert was financially ruined, and he was using my son to drain my empire to save his own. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind calculating the final strike. The sun had completely set behind the towering skyline by the time I parked my vehicle outside an unassuming, weathered brick building in the heart of the financial district. The city streets were emptying, but my night was just beginning. I rode the rattling freight elevator to the 4th floor and walked directly into the dimly lit, severely cluttered office of Bradley. Bradley was a brilliant, reclusive forensic accountant who possessed the relentless, unforgiving instincts of a starved bloodhound tracking a fresh scent. I had employed his highly specialized services exactly once over 12 years ago, when a trusted regional manager attempted to embezzle substantial fuel funds from my growing logistics company. Bradley did not just find the missing money buried in a maze of ledgers. He systematically unearthed the manager's hidden offshore accounts and handed me a fully documented airtight prosecution file within 48 hours. He was the only man I trusted to navigate the digital underworld without asking unnecessary questions. I walked past his startled assistant and dropped my heavy leather briefcase directly onto his cluttered desk. Bradley looked up from his glowing dual monitors with a sharp, calculating gaze. I did not exchange pleasantries, discuss the weather, or offer a polite greeting. I immediately pulled out the bank confirmation receipt for the $47,000 wire transfer and slid it across the polished wood. I instructed him to trace every single digital footprint, routing ping, and structural pathway attached to that specific financial transaction. I then provided him with the corporate identification details for Robert's holding company and the devastating bankruptcy intelligence my attorney Thomas had relayed to me earlier that evening. I demanded a total microscopic audit of Robert's failing corporate enterprise. I needed to know exactly how much debt Robert was hiding from the world, and precisely where my supposed wedding contribution had actually landed. Bradley studied the wire transfer receipt for several long moments before looking back at my face. He recognized the heavy absolute silence of a man preparing for total corporate warfare. He pushed his half-eaten dinner aside, cracked his knuckles, and began typing furiously into his encrypted terminal. He warned me that unwinding commercial shell companies usually took weeks of tedious legal navigation and bureaucratic delays. I did not accept his timeline. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my Platinum corporate credit card, and placed it directly over his keyboard. I told him he had exactly until midnight to bring me the truth. He nodded once, understanding the stakes, and locked the heavy office door. I poured myself a cup of stale, bitter black coffee from his small break room and sat in the leather armchair opposite his desk. I watched the green lines of code reflect against his thick glasses as he hacked through the complex labyrinth of corporate deception. The quiet, rhythmic hum of his computer server was the only sound in the room. I waited patiently in the shadows while he systematically stripped away the false layers of Robert's elaborate financial smokescreen. 3 agonizing hours later, Bradley leaned back in his heavy office chair and exhaled a long, exhausted breath. He turned his primary monitor to face me, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. The bright screen displayed a highly complex web of intersecting red and blue transactional lines, connecting various limited liability corporations like a sprawling digital spiderweb. Bradley pointed a pen directly to the original $47,000 deposit that had initiated my descent into this nightmare. He explained in a calm, clinical voice that the money had never touched a wedding planner, a high-end caterer, or a luxury estate management firm. Within 10 minutes of my initial wire transfer clearing the central bank, the funds were immediately siphoned into a secondary holding account, registered under a highly generic corporate acronym. Bradley had systematically cracked the registration shields protecting that specific acronym using proprietary tracing algorithms. The shell company was entirely owned, operated, and controlled by Robert. My son had not been defrauded by a negligent external vendor or a fraudulent wedding service. He had willingly and deliberately transferred my hard-earned money directly into his father-in-law's hidden accounts under a completely fabricated pretext. Bradley zoomed in on the final digital destination of the misappropriated funds. The money sat in the protective shell account for exactly 2 hours before it was automatically drafted by a federal revenue agency. Robert had maliciously used my wedding gift to pay off a massive looming corporate tax lien that was legally scheduled to trigger an asset freeze the very next morning. The elaborate, beautiful story about the exclusive waterfront wedding venue was nothing more than a complete fabrication entirely designed to mask a desperate 11th-hour financial bailout. Jordan had literally bought his way into Emily's elitist, arrogant family by paying off her father's imminent legal debts with my life savings. My son had willingly sacrificed my wealth to purchase the superficial approval of a man who looked at my calloused hands with undisguised haughty contempt. Jordan knew perfectly well that his new father-in-law was completely bankrupt and he had eagerly participated in a coordinated criminal scheme to defraud me just to keep Robert's failing empire afloat for a few more weeks. The extravagant wedding ceremony I had attended was merely a theatrical production, a desperate visual facade erected by a family absolutely terrified of losing their precious social status. I stared at the cold, irrefutable digital proof of my son's profound betrayal, illuminating the dark room. He had knowingly traded his own father for a fragile seat at a dining table that was already rapidly sinking beneath the waves of total financial ruin. Bradley did not stop with the routed wire transfer. He continued to dig relentlessly through the burning digital wreckage of Robert's shattered financial portfolio. He bypassed another security firewall and opened a newly decrypted file detailing the physical assets still tethered to Robert's remaining operational shell companies. He read the commercial inventory aloud, listing a few heavily depreciated delivery vans, outdated office equipment, and outstanding vendor invoices. Then he paused, his eyes narrowing sharply at a specific line item buried deep within the commercial property ledger. He clicked the digital document to enlarge the registered address of Robert's primary distribution warehouse. Bradley turned to me and informed me that Robert was currently operating the last remnants of his failing business out of a massive commercial sector located on the heavily industrialized east side of the city. He read the exact street address aloud, enunciating every single syllable. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face, completely transforming my rigid posture. My shoulders relaxed as the perfect poetic irony of the situation settled over me like a warm cloak. I recognized that specific commercial address instantly. Following the devastating global economic crash of 2008, I had aggressively expanded my logistical network to capitalize on the falling real estate market. I had utilized a heavily shielded anonymous blind trust to quietly purchase several distressed industrial properties across that exact sector of the city. I desperately needed the extensive warehouse space to secure overnight parking maintenance bays and loading docks for my rapidly growing fleet of heavy freight trucks. The blind trust insulated my identity completely, ensuring rival logistics firms could not track my aggressive territorial expansion or undercut my bids. I still owned every single square foot of that commercial district. I looked at Bradley and instructed him to immediately pull the property management records for that specific warehouse block. He accessed the municipal registry and confirmed the active operational lease agreement. Robert was renting his final operational building directly from my blind trust. He was my direct tenant. My son was committing severe federal wire fraud to steal my retirement funds in order to save a man whose entire livelihood rested entirely on the property I legally controlled. Robert had looked down his nose at me during the elegant wedding reception, utterly unaware that the quiet older man he had deliberately banished to a dark corner table by the kitchen doors literally owned the ground his failing company stood upon. The mystery of the missing $47,000 was entirely resolved, but a new, infinitely more powerful weapon had just been placed directly into my hands. I stood up from the deep leather chair and buttoned my tailored charcoal suit jacket. The parameters of the battlefield had shifted dramatically in my absolute favor. I thanked Bradley for his exceptional, flawless work and walked out into the cool, silent night air. I realized I held absolute, unquestionable power over Robert's remaining existence, and the long overdue time for eviction had finally arrived. The humid afternoon air hung heavy over my modest porch when the sudden sharp rapping at the front door broke the silence. I did not need to check the security monitor to know who was standing on the other side. Jordan and Emily had finally returned from Greece. I opened the door to find them standing on the welcome mat, without a shred of the relaxed, glowing aura one expects from a newlywed couple fresh off a Mediterranean honeymoon. They looked exhausted, rigid, and deeply strained. Emily's designer luggage looked scuffed, and her posture was defensive. Jordan carried heavy dark circles under his eyes, which served as a clear symptom of a man who had spent the last 2 weeks desperately managing frozen credit cards and rapidly dwindling cash reserves from a foreign country. They pushed past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation or offering a traditional greeting. Emily immediately began brushing invisible dust from the sleeve of her silk blouse, while complaining loudly about the oppressive humidity and the lack of mature shade trees in my working-class neighborhood. She remarked that the houses on my street were stacked far too close together, and the air smelled entirely too much like hot asphalt. I closed the front door quietly and followed them into the kitchen. Jordan dropped his heavy ring of keys onto the laminate table and took a seat. He folded his hands together and leaned forward, adopting a posture of manufactured sincerity. He looked up at me with an expression of deep, calculated sorrow. The arrogant, demanding tone he had used over the phone at the airport was entirely gone. In its place, he offered a chilling, theatrical performance of filial piety and deep concern. He told me he was profoundly worried about my declining health. Jordan lowered his voice to a gentle, patronizing whisper that instantly made my blood run cold. He stated that he had noticed highly alarming changes in my daily behavior over the past few months. He fabricated a series of outright lies with a terrifying natural ease. He claimed he had visited the house shortly before the wedding and found the gas stove left burning unattended for hours. He insisted I had been severely misplacing important financial mail and entirely forgetting simple everyday conversations we had shared. He was carefully establishing the exact narrative outlined in the fraudulent medical dossier he had secretly submitted to my commercial bank. My own son was attempting to systematically dismantle my grip on reality right in my own kitchen, looking me directly in the eyes while he lied. Emily stepped closer and placed a heavy, glossy brochure onto the center of the kitchen table. The vibrant cover featured smiling elderly residents sitting in a perfectly manicured courtyard, bathed in warm sunlight. She chimed in with a sweet, venomous tone, explaining that she and Jordan had spent countless sleepless nights researching the best possible living arrangements for my specific deteriorating condition. She described a premier luxury care facility located many miles outside the city limits, far away from my business and my neighborhood. She claimed it offered round-the-clock medical supervision and a serene, isolated environment perfectly suited for a man entering his final vulnerable years. Jordan reached into his leather messenger bag and produced a thick stack of crisp legal documents. He slid a heavy silver pen across the table toward my hand. He told me these were merely preliminary admission forms designed to secure my spot on the care facility's highly competitive waiting list. He assured me it was just a basic precautionary measure to protect my physical well-being in case my memory continued to fail me. I stared down at the documents, recognizing the dense legal formatting instantly. They were not standard nursing home admission forms. They were the original signature pages of the medical power of attorney, designed to strip away my entire legal existence and grant Jordan absolute control over my life savings. I did not throw the silver pen back at his face or tear the fraudulent documents into pieces. A seasoned commander does not reveal his hidden artillery before the enemy is fully committed and trapped on the battlefield. I slowly lowered my head and let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the exact physical image of a tired, defeated old man who could no longer fight the passage of time. I rubbed my eyes with a deliberately trembling hand and let out a long, weary sigh. I told Jordan that his words were incredibly difficult to hear, but I appreciated his profound dedication to my safety. I reached out with shaking fingers and gently pulled the legal packet toward my side of the table. I promised him I would put on my reading glasses and review the preliminary forms carefully before going to bed tonight. Jordan visibly relaxed his rigid posture. A smug, victorious gleam flashed in his dark eyes as he stood up from the kitchen table. He genuinely believed his psychological manipulation had worked flawlessly, and that my massive fortune was finally within his grasp. Emily offered a tight, satisfied smile before turning on her heel and marching back toward the front door, eager to escape the confines of my modest home. Jordan followed closely behind her, pausing only to remind me to sign the bottom of every single page where he had placed small yellow sticky notes. I stood silently in the living room and watched through the front window as they climbed into their luxury vehicle and drove away toward their newly purchased townhouse. The exact moment their car disappeared around the corner, my slumped posture vanished completely. The manufactured trembling in my hands ceased entirely, leaving behind absolute lethal stillness. I walked back into the kitchen and picked up my mobile phone from the counter. I bypassed my standard contacts and opened a highly secure encrypted messaging application. I selected the direct line to my private attorney, Thomas. I typed 2 precise words into the text field and hit the send button. Directive Delta. I placed the phone back on the counter. The trap I had meticulously built around Robert's failing corporate warehouse was now fully armed, and the total financial execution of Emily's family was officially in motion. I knew Jordan's arrogance was only matched by his profound impatience. He had left my house believing he had successfully planted the seeds of my legal demise, entirely confident that I would obediently sign the medical power of attorney without question. However, a man actively drowning in a violent sea of corporate debt cannot afford the luxury of waiting for the slow, grinding machinery of the family court system to formally process guardianship papers. Robert's sprawling commercial warehouse was on the absolute brink of foreclosure, and the federal auditors were closing in rapidly. They needed immediate liquid cash to stall the bank executives and secure their crumbling social facade. I deduced with absolute tactical certainty that Jordan would not simply wait for the legal paperwork to clear before making his next move. He would inevitably attempt to expedite the massive theft by quietly locating my private financial ledgers. He needed to secure my routing numbers, account balances, and security clearance codes to prepare the wire transfers the very second he gained legal authorization over my estate. He would need a comprehensive, highly detailed map of my assets to know exactly where to strike when the time came. I decided to carefully draw that exact map for him. I sat in the quiet solitude of my home office and dialed Bradley on my secured line. The forensic accountant answered immediately, the familiar sound of rapid keyboard typing echoing loudly in the background. I instructed Bradley to temporarily halt his ongoing deep audit of Robert's failing enterprise and immediately pivot his skills to a highly sensitive fabrication project. I needed a completely fraudulent, meticulously crafted portfolio of my personal wealth. I detailed the exact specifications required to perfectly bait the trap for my son. The fake ledgers needed to display my assets not as complex, illiquid commercial real estate trusts or locked logistics bonds, but as massive, easily accessible cash reserves sitting in highly vulnerable offshore accounts. I needed Jordan to look at these printed documents and see tens of millions of dollars completely unprotected, ripe for the taking. Bradley understood the dangerous assignment instantly. He noted that crafting convincing bank statements required perfectly mimicking the encryption codes, font typography, and watermarked institutional letterheads of top-tier global wealth management firms. He promised to deliver the fabricated portfolio by early morning, assuring me the documents would pass any preliminary visual inspection. I ended the call feeling the cold, methodical rhythm of my counteroffensive falling into perfect alignment. Jordan was desperate for a financial lifeline, and I was about to throw him a heavy iron anvil expertly disguised as a life preserver. Bradley arrived at my house long before the sun had fully breached the horizon, slipping through the morning fog like a phantom. He carried a slim, unmarked leather folio containing the highly sensitive fabricated financial documents. He spread the crisp papers across my laminate kitchen table with the meticulous, proud care of a master counterfeiter, displaying his finest work. The portfolios were breathtakingly deceptive and terrifyingly realistic. They detailed an elaborate, sprawling network of high-yield savings accounts and unrestricted commercial credit lines, boasting liquid balances that would make any desperate, greedy man abandon all logic and caution. The documents painted a brilliant picture of absolute financial liquidity, explicitly suggesting that staggering sums of money could be moved across international borders with a single authorized digital signature. Jordan would view this specific portfolio as his absolute salvation, the perfect solution to Robert's impending bankruptcy. Bradley pulled a small, heavy ultraviolet light pen from his inner jacket pocket and illuminated the surface of the top bank statement. A complex, iridescent barcode instantly materialized across the heavy paper fibers, glowing with a sharp neon intensity. He calmly explained the brilliant lethal mechanics of the trap he had constructed. He had not printed the financial portfolios on standard commercial stock. The paper had been carefully treated with a highly specialized chemical watermark utilized exclusively by federal fraud prevention agencies to track organized crime syndicates. This specific chemical compound remained completely invisible to the naked human eye and could not be detected by standard digital smartphone cameras. However, the moment these physical documents were fed into a high-resolution commercial banking scanner, or the moment the fraudulent routing numbers printed on them were entered into the Federal Reserve wire system for verification, the optical character recognition software would instantly detect the embedded chemical anomaly. Bradley stated with absolute clinical precision that the watermark functioned as a highly sensitive digital tripwire. If Jordan attempted to verify these specific account numbers or physically submit these documents to any registered financial institution to expedite his fraudulent power of attorney claim, the federal banking network would automatically trigger a silent, unblockable alarm. The security system would instantly freeze the requested transaction, lock the terminal of the submitting party, and dispatch an immediate priority alert to the federal authorities regarding an active massive wire fraud in progress. It was not a passive defensive measure meant to block a transfer. It was a highly aggressive, self-detonating explosive disguised as ultimate financial salvation. I stared at the faint, glowing barcode under the ultraviolet light, marveling at the ruthless, unforgiving efficiency of the design. Jordan believed he was cleverly stealing my life's work to save his new, arrogant father-in-law. Instead, he would be voluntarily handing his own undeniable criminal confession directly to the federal government. I thanked Bradley for his flawless execution, took possession of the lethal documents, and prepared to set the stage for my son's final, catastrophic mistake. I carried the chemically treated documents directly into my home office. I retrieved a heavy fireproof steel lockbox from the very bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. This was the specific, secure lockbox where I had stored my most critical tax returns, logistics manifests, and property deeds during Jordan's entire teenage years. I knew with absolute certainty that he was intimately familiar with its existence and its exact location within the house. I placed the fraudulent financial portfolios inside, carefully ensuring the fake account numbers and poisoned routing codes were prominently displayed on the top pages for maximum visibility. I closed the heavy steel lid and engaged the complex locking mechanism with a loud click. I did not attempt to hide the key in a complex, impenetrable location that would frustrate him. I slid it directly beneath the heavy base of a brass desk lamp, utilizing the exact hiding spot I had used 2 decades ago when Jordan still lived under my roof. A desperate, panicked thief always relies on old, deeply ingrained familiar habits. To ensure absolute certainty regarding his impending intrusion, I pulled a single microscopic thread from the cuff of my wool sweater and laid it delicately across the dark seam of the lockbox lid. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and left the house through the front door, making sure to engage the deadbolt loudly. I embarked on a long, slow walk through the quiet neighborhood streets, deliberately giving Jordan an expansive, completely unhindered window of opportunity to execute his raid. He still possessed the spare key to my front door, a privilege I had intentionally left unrevoked, solely to facilitate this exact moment of betrayal. I walked for 2 solid hours in the brisk morning air, feeling the familiar heavy weight of impending conflict settling over my shoulders. When I finally returned and unlocked my front door, the house was draped in absolute, perfect silence. I moved with slow, deliberate steps toward my home office. I stood in the doorway and scanned the environment with the brutal efficiency of a trained auditor. A careless observer would have noticed nothing out of the ordinary. But 40 years of auditing massive logistics manifests trains the human eye to detect the smallest physical discrepancies. The heavy oak desk chair was angled exactly 2 degrees further toward the window than how I had meticulously placed it. A slight, barely visible indentation marked the surface of the woven wool rug where someone had knelt in a frantic hurry. I approached the desk and looked at the brass lamp. It was shifted exactly half an inch to the left, exposing a sliver of clean wood untouched by dust. Finally, I stared down at the steel lockbox. The lid was completely secured, but the microscopic thread I had placed across the seam was entirely gone. I opened the box and examined the contents. The pages of the fabricated portfolio were perfectly aligned, but the crisp edges felt slightly worn from rapid aggressive handling. Jordan had taken the bait completely. He had entered my home, located the hidden key, and frantically photographed every single page of the chemically treated documents using his mobile phone camera. He now possessed the poisoned routing numbers he desperately needed to execute his massive theft. The trap was successfully armed and completely irreversible. The entire federal banking system was now a ticking time bomb, and my son was holding the detonator directly in his trembling hands. The execution of Directive Delta commenced with the ruthless efficiency of a perfectly calibrated machine. Within minutes of receiving my encrypted message, Thomas activated the full weight of my legal division. We did not need to fabricate a single grievance or stretch a legal technicality to destroy Robert's commercial sanctuary. The man had already dug his own grave through sheer financial incompetence and profound arrogance. Thomas meticulously reviewed the commercial lease agreement binding Robert's failing distribution company to the warehouse property controlled by my blind trust. The documentation revealed a catastrophic string of violations. Robert had missed 3 consecutive monthly lease payments, ignored repeated municipal tax warnings, and secretly attempted to sublet a portion of the loading dock to an unauthorized third-party vendor in a desperate bid to generate liquid cash. Any single one of these infractions constituted a severe breach of contract. Combined, they granted the property owner absolute authority to bypass standard arbitration and initiate an immediate, unappealable termination of the lease. I sat in the quiet solitude of my home office and listened to Thomas outline the tactical strike over the phone. He spoke with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon excising a malignant tumor. I instructed him to show absolutely zero leniency. The blind trust was to invoke the most aggressive eviction clause permitted under state commercial law. We were not going to offer Robert a payment plan, a grace period, or a chance to renegotiate the terms of his survival. We were going to sever his operational lifeline completely. Thomas prepared the formal notice of lease termination, citing the specific financial violations with devastating clarity. He attached a legally binding order to vacate the premises stamped with the unmistakable seal of the state court. Because the property was zoned entirely for commercial use, and the default was so profound, the standard 30-day grace period did not apply. Robert was granted exactly 48 hours to remove his inventory, vacate his employees, and surrender the keys to the facility or face immediate physical removal by the county sheriff. The trap I had patiently constructed was no longer a theoretical threat hanging in the shadows. It was a solid, devastating reality moving directly toward his front door. Thomas confirmed that a licensed process server had been dispatched with the documents. The weapon had been fired. I simply had to wait for the impact. I poured myself a glass of water and looked out the window, visualizing the courier navigating the midday traffic. There is a profound, chilling peace that settles over a man when he knows his enemy is about to face total annihilation. Robert had constructed his entire identity on the illusion of superiority and immense wealth. He had looked at me with undisguised pity during the wedding reception, utterly unaware that his entire universe was built on sand. Now the tide was finally coming in. The crushing blow landed precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Through the extensive network of surveillance cameras I maintained across my commercial properties, I watched the entire sequence unfold in real time from the secure monitor on my desk. A black sedan pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of Robert's East Side warehouse. A process server stepped out, holding a thick manila envelope, and walked purposefully through the main glass doors of the failing corporate headquarters. He did not engage in polite conversation with the remaining skeleton crew of reception staff. He demanded to see the owner directly. Within moments, Robert emerged from his private office, his face already etched with the deep, exhausting strain of a man constantly fighting off creditors. The process server handed him the heavy envelope, secured his signature of receipt, and walked out without a second glance. I watched the live feed intently as Robert tore open the envelope right there in the middle of the lobby. The color drained from his face with staggering speed. His shoulders collapsed and he staggered backward, leaning heavily against the reception desk for physical support, as his eyes darted frantically across the legal text. The 48-hour eviction notice was absolute and irreversible. He realized in an instant that his business was officially dead, his facade was shattered, and his total financial ruin was no longer a looming possibility, but an immediate, terrifying reality. Robert did not call his attorney or attempt to contact the faceless property management group representing the blind trust. He knew he possessed absolutely no leverage and zero capital to fight a corporate eviction. Instead, he retreated into his office, slammed the door shut, and immediately pulled out his mobile phone. He called the only remaining lifeline he had left. He called my son. I could easily imagine the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating through the phone line. Robert was undoubtedly demanding that Jordan finalize the acquisition of my assets that very instant. The $47,000 Jordan had previously stolen had merely delayed the inevitable tax lien, but it had not saved the physical building. Robert needed a massive infusion of capital to immediately buy a new warehouse or bribe his current faceless landlord into a desperate settlement. Jordan was suddenly trapped in a vice of his own making. The wealthy, powerful father-in-law he had worshipped and sacrificed his own blood to impress was now screaming at him for salvation. The fake wealth was crumbling, and the pressure on Jordan to execute his theft was now absolute and immediate. Less than 10 minutes after Robert received the eviction notice, my private mobile phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed Jordan's name exactly as I had calculated. I let the phone ring 4 times carefully, controlling my breathing and allowing the silence in the room to center my focus. I picked up the device and answered with a slow, trembling voice, perfectly resuming the character of a confused, exhausted old man. Jordan did not bother with pleasantries or ask about my day. His voice was vibrating with a chaotic, manufactured urgency that bordered on genuine hysteria. He launched into a rapid, deeply convoluted lie, claiming that a massive, catastrophic tax emergency had just surfaced regarding my estate. He frantically explained that the federal government was preparing to freeze all of my personal and business accounts by tomorrow morning, due to a severe clerical error from decades ago. He insisted that the only way to protect my life savings and ensure my medical care was to execute the power of attorney immediately. He begged me to sign the preliminary documents he had left on the kitchen table so he could shield my wealth from the impending government seizure. He was deploying the exact gaslighting tactics he had planned, amplifying the pressure to a fever pitch. I listened to his desperate, lying voice and felt the last remaining shred of paternal warmth turn into solid ice. I did not argue or question his absurd narrative. I played my role with flawless precision. I let out a long, fearful gasp and told him I was incredibly confused and terrified of losing everything I had built. I agreed that he needed to take control to save our family. I promised him I would sign every single document exactly as he instructed. The relief rushing out of him was palpable over the phone line. However, I added one final non-negotiable condition. I told Jordan in a fragile, pleading tone that I did not want to sign away my life alone. I insisted that this was a major family transition, and I needed the comfort of my loved ones around me. I instructed him to bring Emily and her parents to my house tonight at exactly 8 o'clock so we could finalize the paperwork together as a united family. Jordan hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his blinding greed and Robert's crushing deadline forced his hand. He eagerly agreed to the terms, promising they would all be there tonight. He ended the call, believing he had secured his ultimate victory. He did not realize that the final confrontation was now scheduled, and he was willingly bringing his entire treacherous circle directly into my firing line. The afternoon light faded into a deep bruised twilight as I moved through the rooms of my modest home. I did not hire a cleaning service to prepare for the impending arrival. I personally scrubbed the hardwood floors and wiped down the countertops, moving with the rhythmic mechanical precision of a man preparing a sterile operating theater. Every speck of dust was eradicated. Every misplaced item was systematically categorized and hidden from view. I wanted the environment to be absolutely immaculate, offering no physical evidence of the cognitive decline Jordan had so desperately attempted to project upon me. I walked into the dining room and stood before the heavy oak table. This was the exact surface where I had fed Jordan for 18 consecutive years. It was the table where I had patiently reviewed his middle school report cards, where I had celebrated his high school graduation, and where I had signed the massive checks that fully funded his elite university education. I traced the grain of the wood, feeling the microscopic dents left by his childhood homework assignments. The ghost of the boy I raised lingered in the quiet corners of the room, but I forcefully banished the sentiment. The boy was dead. In his place stood a ruthless corporate thief who was currently plotting my institutionalization. I pulled out the 4 wooden chairs and aligned them perfectly with the edges of the table. I walked to my secure briefcase and extracted 4 identical heavy black leather folders. I had instructed Thomas to prepare these specific dossiers earlier in the afternoon. I placed 1 folder at each seating position, aligning them with geometrical precision. They sat on the dark wood like execution warrants waiting for their targets. I did not include a folder for myself, nor did I leave a chair at the head of the table for my own use. I would not be sitting during this engagement. A man commanding an ambush does not take a seat at the table with his enemies. He stands above them, controlling the entire spatial dynamic of the room to maintain absolute psychological dominance. The physical preparation of the environment was now complete. My house was no longer a sanctuary of family memories. It had been systematically transformed into a perfectly constructed legal trap meticulously designed to permanently sever the parasitic connections that had infiltrated my life. Physical intimidation and moral superiority are utterly useless in a court of law without irrefutable hard evidence. I knew Robert and Victoria would arrive armed with their characteristic arrogance, and Jordan would deploy his sickeningly manufactured concern. They would lie, manipulate, and attempt to aggressively coerce me into signing away my entire legal existence. I needed every single word, every veiled threat, and every arrogant demand captured with absolute digital perfection. I opened a specialized tactical case containing 3 high-definition motion-activated surveillance cameras I had rapidly procured from a trusted corporate security vendor. I moved to the main living area and embedded the first camera deep within the dense shadows of the upper bookshelf, angling the lens downward to capture the entire expanse of the dining room table. I secured the second camera directly behind the large flat-screen television, focusing the wide-angle lens directly on the primary entryway and the foyer to record their uninvited entrance. I positioned the final camera inside the intricate metalwork of the dining room chandelier, providing a flawless, unobstructed aerial view of the 4 black leather folders and the hands of anyone reaching for them. I powered on my encrypted tablet and synced the optical feeds to a secure offshore cloud server. The visual resolution was razor-sharp. I engaged the highly sensitive omnidirectional microphones and tested the audio pickup. I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock perfectly rendered through the digital speakers. The surveillance grid was entirely invisible and completely inescapable. I closed the tablet and locked it inside the bottom drawer of my heavy desk. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of bitter black coffee. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the dim, deepening shadows of the living room, letting the silence wrap around me like armor. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 7:45 in the evening. I drank the dark liquid slowly, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus to a lethal, unforgiving edge. I was not nervous. I felt the cold, calculated calm of a sniper, waiting patiently for the enemy to step directly into the crosshairs. The emotional turmoil and heartbreak of the past few weeks had been entirely burned away, leaving only a pure, diamond, hard resolve. I had spent 40 years building a lucrative empire through sweat strategy and ruthless efficiency. Tonight, I would use those exact same tools to dismantle the arrogant people who believed they could effortlessly steal it from me. I placed the empty coffee mug on the granite counter and stood perfectly still in the dark, waiting for the invasion to begin. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy brass handle of my front door clicked loudly. There was no polite knock. There was no respectful hesitation or announcement of their arrival. Jordan simply used his spare key and pushed the heavy door open, treating my private home with the casual entitlement of a landlord entering a vacant, worthless property. The heavy footsteps of 4 people echoed loudly across the hardwood floor of the foyer. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the living room and met them in the center of the house. Emily entered first, closely flanking her husband. Directly behind them stood Robert and Victoria. They looked profoundly exhausted, their faces tight with the aggressive, frantic energy of people cornered by impending, catastrophic ruin. Robert was sweating through his expensive, tailored suit, his eyes darting around the room with feral desperation. Victoria immediately raised a manicured hand to her face, pressing a silk handkerchief against her nose. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply murmured to Emily about the stale, suffocating smell of the old house, audibly complaining that the neighborhood lacked basic sanitation standards and belonged in a slum. She treated my physical presence as a mild, distasteful environmental inconvenience. Robert did not waste time playing the role of the concerned family patriarch. He bypassed Jordan completely and marched directly into the dining room. He stopped abruptly when he saw the 4 black leather folders waiting symmetrically on the table. He turned toward me, his face flushed with extreme impatience and barely suppressed panic. He reached inside his jacket, pulled out the thick stack of fraudulent medical power of attorney documents, and slapped them violently onto the center of the wooden table. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. He ordered me to stop wasting their valuable time and sign the papers immediately. He stated in a demanding, highly authoritative tone that they had an urgent, massive business crisis to resolve tonight and could not afford to spend hours managing my personal senile delusions. He commanded Jordan to hand me a pen, explicitly directing his son-in-law to expedite the legal transfer so they could escape this depressing environment. The sheer audacity of his demand cemented the absolute reality of the situation. Robert was attempting to seize my fortune by brute force to buy back his commercial warehouse before the sheriff locked the doors tomorrow morning. I looked at Robert, then at Victoria Emily, and finally at Jordan. My son stood silently, offering absolutely no defense of my home or my dignity. He simply stared at the legal documents, his eyes burning with desperate, unfiltered greed. The trap had effectively closed. They were all standing exactly where I needed them to be. The time for deception had ended. The moment of absolute truth had begun. I did not reach for the heavy silver pen Jordan extended toward my hand. I did not break my gaze or offer a single syllable of compliance to Robert's aggressive demands. I remained perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the dining room until Robert's arrogant bluster began to falter. The sudden absence of the frail, accommodating old man they had expected to find severely disrupted their coordinated momentum. I slowly lowered my hands to my sides, standing completely upright, projecting the absolute, unforgiving authority of a man who owned the battlefield. I instructed them to sit down. My voice did not tremble. It did not carry the manufactured weakness I had displayed just hours earlier in the kitchen. It was cold, resonant, and echoed with the unmistakable cadence of a corporate executive issuing a final, non-negotiable directive. Robert opened his mouth to protest, his face flushing with renewed indignation, but the sheer gravity of my posture silenced him. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her silk handkerchief dropping to her side. One by one, driven by a sudden primal realization that the dynamic in the room had shifted violently against them, they pulled out the wooden chairs and sat down at the table. I remained standing, towering over them, controlling the physical space with absolute precision. I gestured calmly toward the 4 black leather folders, meticulously aligned at their respective seating positions. I told them that before I placed my signature on any legally binding document that would effectively erase my autonomy and transfer my life savings into their hands, I required a moment of their undivided attention. I stated that we needed to conduct a comprehensive review of their recent financial investments and strategic purchases. I looked directly at Jordan, ensuring he felt the full, piercing weight of my scrutiny. I explained that an estate transfer of this massive magnitude demanded total transparency among all involved parties. I instructed them to open the dossiers. Jordan frowned, casting a quick, nervous glance at Emily. Robert crossed his arms over his chest, attempting to maintain his facade of aristocratic impatience, muttering that this was a ridiculous waste of time. I simply nodded toward the table and reiterated my command. The trap was fully sprung, and they were sitting directly in the center of the jaws. I watched as their initial arrogance slowly dissolved into a creeping, undeniable apprehension. They had walked into my home expecting a swift, effortless execution of their fraudulent scheme. Instead, they found themselves subjected to a rigid, highly structured corporate audit. I told them that the contents of those black folders represented the exact culmination of their meticulous planning over the past several months. I urged them not to delay any further. I wanted them to see precisely what their arrogance had purchased. Emily, driven by her characteristic impatience and a deep-seated sense of entitlement, reached out and flipped open her leather folder first. She clearly expected to find tedious banking disclosures or outdated trust agreements that she could quickly dismiss. Instead, her eyes landed directly on the comprehensive forensic financial trace Bradley had finalized just hours ago. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails trace the thick, highlighted red lines, mapping the journey of the $47,000 I had wired for her supposed wedding venue. She stared at the bank routing numbers, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she read the name of the recipient account. It was not a luxury waterfront estate management firm. It was a generic commercial holding company. Beneath the routing trace, a separate certified document clearly identified Robert as the sole owner and primary beneficiary of that specific shell corporation. A final municipal tax receipt was stapled to the back, explicitly proving that the exact sum of $47,000 had been automatically drafted by a federal revenue agency to satisfy a massive delinquent corporate tax lien. Emily gasped, the sound sharp and ragged in the quiet room. Her confusion rapidly morphed into sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked up from the dossier, her eyes wide with shock, and turned her gaze toward her father. She realized in a singular, devastating instant that her entire dream wedding, the lavish country club reception, and the illusion of her family's enduring wealth had been entirely funded by my stolen money. Jordan had not generously paid for a venue. He had literally bought his way into her elitist family by secretly bailing out her bankrupt father. The pristine social facade she had guarded so fiercely was nothing more than a hollow, criminal lie. Robert saw the color drain completely from his daughter's face. Sweating profusely and visibly vibrating with defensive rage, he violently ripped open his own black folder to deflect the sudden suffocating tension in the room. He snatched the top document and brought it close to his face, ready to issue a blistering, arrogant dismissal. Instead, the air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, choked wheeze. He was holding the original notarized property deed to the sprawling commercial warehouse on the east side of the city. The legal text clearly identified my anonymous blind trust, but the unredacted signatory page explicitly named me as the sole proprietor and absolute controlling entity of the estate. Directly beneath the property deed lay a pristine, certified copy of the 48-hour eviction notice he had been served that very afternoon. Robert's hands began to shake violently. The heavy document fluttered against the wooden table. The arrogant, condescending patriarch who had despised my working-class roots suddenly realized that the faceless, ruthless landlord, who had just completely destroyed his corporate livelihood, was standing right in front of him. His eyes darted up to meet mine, reflecting absolute paralyzing terror. Jordan sat frozen, watching the complete psychological collapse of his new wife and his powerful father-in-law unfold in real time. The manufactured concern he had weaponized to orchestrate this entire invasion evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal panic. His breathing became shallow and erratic. Desperate to find some shred of leverage or remaining control, he lunged forward and tore open his designated folder. He flipped past the cover sheet, expecting to find the chemically watermarked decoy documents he had illegally photographed earlier that morning. Instead, he found a thick, heavy stack of premium bonded paper bearing the unassailable corporate seal of the state's leading neurological research institute. It was the certified, notarized cognitive evaluation I had commissioned. Jordan's eyes scanned the clinical summaries and the definitive medical conclusions. The document explicitly declared my cognitive function to be exceptionally sharp, proving my absolute mental competence and total financial capability beyond any shadow of legal doubt. Placed directly next to this ironclad medical shield was a high-resolution enlarged copy of the forged medical evaluation Jordan had secretly submitted to my commercial bank. The fabricated symptoms of severe dementia and the fraudulent signature of the non-existent Dr. Evans were highlighted in bright, unforgiving, neon yellow ink. The air in the dining room turned instantly freezing. The heavy, suffocating silence returned, but it was no longer born of arrogance. It was the crushing, absolute silence of total defeat. The grand illusion of their collective power was permanently shattered. Jordan stared at the forged medical document, fully realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. His meticulously constructed cage of medical power of attorney was utterly worthless. He had committed severe, easily provable federal fraud, and I held the undeniable physical evidence directly in my possession. He had walked into my home expecting to conquer an incompetent dying old man, only to discover he had stepped into an inescapable federal trap. The realization of their shared doom did not unite them against me. A syndicate built entirely on greed, lies, and mutual exploitation possesses no inherent loyalty. As the sheer gravity of the federal prison sentences and total financial ruin settled over the table, the fragile alliances completely fractured. Emily turned toward Jordan with a look of absolute burning disgust, realizing her husband was a desperate thief who had humiliated her. Robert turned on Jordan, his face purple with rage, realizing his son-in-law's clumsy financial crimes had exposed his bankruptcy and triggered his eviction. Victoria began to weep hysterically, pointing trembling fingers at her own husband for losing their fortune. The perfect, arrogant family instantly turned into a pack of starving wolves, viciously tearing at each other's throats in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the burning wreckage of their own making. Robert's purple face contorted with an animalistic rage that completely shattered whatever remained of his polished, civilized veneer. He leaned heavily across the oak table, his large frame shaking with a violent intensity as he thrust a blunt, trembling finger directly into Jordan's face. The raw roar that escaped his throat was deafening, filling the quiet dining room with a desperate, frantic venom. He screamed that my son was an absolute fraud, a pathetic failure who had promised unhindered access to an immense logistics fortune, but had instead delivered nothing but an inescapable federal snare. Robert realized with terrifying clarity that Jordan possessed absolutely zero access to my primary corporate accounts, meaning the immediate lifeline required to satisfy his delinquent tax liens and halt the impending foreclosure on his commercial headquarters was entirely non-existent. He bellowed that he had allowed an unrefined, lower-class outsider into his elite family circle under the ironclad promise of massive corporate expansion, only to find himself completely ruined by Jordan's amateurish attempts at financial forgery. Jordan tried to stem the onslaught, stammering about the decoy routing numbers and desperately asserting that the funds were real, but his voice was completely drowned out by the absolute chaos fracturing the room. Emily did not step forward to defend her new husband or offer a single gesture of comfort. The pristine elegance she had carefully manufactured for the wedding ballroom completely vanished, replaced by an ugly, unfiltered malice that twisted her features. She turned on Jordan, her voice rising to a piercing, hysterical shriek that cut through her father's shouts like a blade. She screamed that she had willingly sacrificed her youth and social status to marry him solely because he had explicitly promised her a massive, unassailable inheritance from a legendary logistics empire. She yelled that she would have never looked twice at his face if she had known his father was a stubborn, unyielding laborer who kept his actual wealth locked behind impenetrable corporate vaults. Emily clawed at her own diamond necklace, spitting that Jordan was a parasite who had lied about his retirement strategies to buy her approval. Victoria joined the visual slaughter, weeping hysterically and slapping her hands against her knees, wailing that they had linked their prestigious family name to a common criminal who had successfully engineered their total public destruction. The illusion of their sophisticated, unified royalty disintegrated entirely, leaving behind a ring of backstabbing opportunists desperately seeking a scapegoat for their own greed. They were no longer a dignified family of high society. They were a shattered pack of predators tearing each other apart over a prize that never existed. Jordan's carefully maintained, arrogant facade shattered like brittle ice under the crushing weight of the collective assault. The smug, condescending posture he had adopted when he walked through my door completely dissolved, stripping away every single ounce of the expensive university confidence he had tried to weaponize against me. He staggered backward away from his howling in-laws, his chest heaving as a deep, suffocating panic took absolute control of his body. With a hollow, ragged cry, my son dropped his head and fell heavily to his knees on the hardwood floor right before me. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my jacket, but I stepped back smoothly, refusing to allow his treachery to pollute my physical space. He looked up at me with tear-streaked eyes, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he addressed me as his father for the first time in months. He begged me to listen to him, frantically pleading that he had been entirely trapped by the suffocating societal expectations of Emily's elite world. He claimed he only organized the medical power of attorney because Robert had threatened to cancel the wedding and ruin his social standing if he did not immediately secure the townhouse down payment. Jordan sobbed uncontrollably, gasping that he was still my flesh and blood, and that he had only wanted to make me proud by achieving a higher level of status. I stood perfectly rigid above him, my hands folded calmly behind my back, looking down at his weeping form with the absolute coldness of a judge delivering a final verdict. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single trace of paternal sorrow to alter the rigid set of my jaw. The air in the dining room turned instantly freezing as my silence commanded the environment, suffocating their screaming arguments. I reminded Jordan with absolute, crystalline clarity of the cold phone call he had made to me from the luxury resort just days before the wedding ceremony. I reminded him of how he had calmly informed me that his new world only had space for special elite people of refined status and high culture. I stated in a level, monotone voice that since he had explicitly chosen to categorize his own father as an inconvenient, uninvited outsider who did not belong in his immediate family circle, I was now officially operating under his exact definitions. I told him with unwavering certainty that because I was not immediate family, I owed absolutely nothing to him, his ruined wife, or her bankrupt father. Before Jordan could formulate another desperate plea or offer another shallow excuse, the entire living room was suddenly illuminated by a violent, overlapping cascade of crimson and cobalt light. Brilliant red and blue emergency strobes flashed aggressively through the front windows, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the pristine dining room table and reflecting sharply against the panicking faces of the trapped antagonists. The heavy, unmistakable echo of solid tactical boots resonated loudly from the concrete driveway, followed by the rapid, synchronized approach of multiple individuals advancing onto the front porch. The federal wire fraud tripwire embedded within Bradley's chemically treated portfolio had officially detonated, and the legal consequences had arrived precisely on schedule. Robert's eyes widened in absolute feral panic as the reality of an unfolding federal arrest warrant materialized right outside my door. He let out a strangled shriek of terror, completely abandoned his weeping wife, and frantically bolted toward the rear of the house, desperately seeking an escape route through the dark kitchen to the back exit. Robert's frantic flight was cut short the exact moment his polished Italian leather shoes crossed the threshold of the kitchen entry. He skidded to a violent halt on the slick tile floor, his breath catching painfully in his throat as a cold gasp of raw terror escaped his lips. Standing perfectly still in the dim light of the kitchen, completely blocking the rear exit, was a tall, imposing silhouette. It was Thomas's senior asset enforcement agent, flanking a pair of armed county sheriffs who had already secured the perimeter of the property to execute the immediate physical lockout of Robert's corporate warehouse. Every single exit was entirely sealed, and my home office had successfully become an inescapable permanent legal cage for everyone who tried to exploit me. I looked at the shattered, weeping circle of my enemies and felt a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace. The emotional and financial destruction of the antagonists was completely finalized, and the absolute transition of power was secure. I turned my head slowly toward the front door as the heavy brass lock began to turn from the outside, ready to witness the final sweeping execution of federal justice. The heavy brass lock of my front door disengaged with a sharp metallic snap. The solid oak door swung open, slicing through the chaotic tension in the dining room and letting the harsh, pulsating red and blue emergency lights flood my foyer. Thomas stepped over the threshold with the immaculate, unbothered posture of a man arriving to collect a long overdue debt. He was immediately flanked by two uniformed county sheriffs, their hands resting cautiously on their leather utility belts. Directly behind them stood Bradley, clutching a reinforced silver briefcase containing the final digital manifests. The sheer physical presence of law enforcement instantly neutralized the screaming matches inside my home. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and suffocating. From the rear of the house, heavy footsteps echoed against the laminate flooring. The senior asset enforcement agent emerged from the kitchen shadows, maintaining a firm, inescapable grip on Robert's tailored collar. The agent marched this panicked, sweating patriarch directly back into the dining room and forced him into a vacant chair. Robert offered zero resistance. His aristocratic bluster had been entirely beaten out of him. Thomas stepped forward, stopping precisely at the edge of the dining table. He did not address Robert or Victoria. He fixed his gaze entirely on Jordan. Thomas explained to the room with surgical precision that a silent, unblockable federal alarm had been triggered at exactly 10:14 this morning. He detailed how Jordan had utilized his smartphone to photograph the chemically watermarked routing numbers hidden in my lockbox. Thomas stated that the moment Jordan subsequently ran a preliminary verification check on those fraudulent offshore accounts through his encrypted commercial banking portal, the optical character recognition software instantly flagged the specialized chemical anomaly. The Federal Fraud Prevention Agency had immediately locked Jordan out of his financial terminals, frozen his remaining assets, and dispatched immediate priority warrants to the local authorities. Jordan's face turned the color of ash. He realized the fatal magnitude of his arrogance. He had willingly carried a digital tracking beacon directly into his own bank, handing the federal government an immaculate time-stamped record of his intention to commit massive wire fraud. The trap had executed flawlessly, capturing him the exact second he believed he had won. The older of the two uniformed sheriffs stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He approached Jordan, instructing my son to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Jordan began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving, as the inescapable reality of federal prison materialized before him. He frantically attempted to twist away, stammering a pathetic, disjointed defense. He pointed a trembling finger at Robert, screaming that the entire corporate theft was Robert's idea, and that he had been entirely manipulated into forging the documents to save his father-in-law's failing distribution company. The sheriff ignored the hysterical accusations. He grabbed Jordan's wrists with practiced efficiency, twisting his arms backward. The metallic ratcheting sound of the cuffs snapping shut echoed violently against the dining room walls. The officer read Jordan his Miranda rights in a loud, monotone voice, officially arresting him for severe identity theft, the deliberate forgery of legal medical directives, and attempted felony wire fraud against a federally insured institution. Jordan collapsed, completely sobbing uncontrollably into the collar of his shirt as his social and professional life disintegrated. The second sheriff immediately moved toward the table and stood directly over Robert. Thomas unlatched his leather briefcase and handed the officer a thick, sealed dossier heavily stamped with the district attorney's seal. Bradley stepped forward, confirming aloud that the forensic financial trace detailing the missing $47,000 had already been verified by a federal judge. He stated explicitly that Robert had illegally embezzled protected corporate funds from his investors to satisfy a delinquent municipal tax lien, utilizing my stolen money to mask his deep insolvency. The sheriff ordered Robert to stand. The once powerful patriarch who had mocked my modest home just minutes earlier could barely support his own weight. He staggered upward, his face a portrait of sheer devastation. The second set of handcuffs clicked shut with brutal finality. Robert was formally arrested for corporate embezzlement and gross financial fraud. Victoria let out a piercing, guttural shriek, watching the two men who funded her luxurious existence get physically restrained like common street criminals. The swift mechanical efficiency of the law enforcement officers completely eradicated any remaining illusion of their high society power. Emily was left standing entirely alone amidst the burning wreckage of her carefully curated universe. She stared at the two men in handcuffs, her breath hitching in her throat as the full, terrifying scope of her new reality settled over her shoulders. Her father was a bankrupt criminal. Her new husband was a desperate fraud bound for federal prison. The massive inheritance she had been promised was nothing more than a lethal illusion designed to destroy them. The pristine social status she had wielded like a weapon was permanently gone. Emily slowly turned away from the officers and locked her gaze onto me. The arrogant, condescending young woman who had complained about the smell of my home completely vanished. She dropped the elitist facade entirely and took a hesitant, trembling step toward me. Tears streamed down her meticulously powdered face, ruining her expensive makeup. She clasped her hands together and began to beg. She pleaded with me to intervene, desperately citing our supposed family connection. She claimed that she was my daughter-in-law, that she was young and had been deceived by Jordan's ambition, and that I could not possibly let the authorities destroy her entire life. She begged me to speak to Thomas to withdraw the financial tracing documents and to show mercy for the sake of the family name. I remained standing perfectly still, my hands resting calmly by my sides. I looked at her with absolute glacial indifference. I did not feel a single trace of pity for the woman who had happily plotted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. I stared directly into her tear-filled eyes and delivered my final assessment with cold surgical precision. I told Emily that she possessed absolutely no family connection to me whatsoever. I stated clearly that she had willingly married a desperate fraud solely to generate the liquid capital required to bail out a confirmed thief. Her entire existence was built on parasitic exploitation, and the host had just permanently severed the connection. I instructed her to stop weeping and to gather her hysterical mother. I pointed a steady finger toward the open front door, commanding them to vacate my property immediately. The officers began marching Jordan and Robert out of the dining room, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Emily staggered backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound, realizing she was now completely destitute, utterly alone and permanently exiled from the only fortune that could have saved her. The weeks following the arrests were a masterclass in aggressive corporate sanitation. I instructed Thomas to initiate a total financial purge, moving with ruthless efficiency to sever every remaining legal and financial tie to the parasites who had attempted to consume my life. The first order of business was the comprehensive rewriting of my last will and testament. I sat in Thomas's immaculate downtown office reviewing the thick, archaic estate plan I had drafted decades ago, when Jordan was still a child. With a few decisive strokes of a heavy fountain pen, I completely and irrevocably disinherited him. I legally excised his name from my blind trusts, my international life insurance policies, my real estate holdings, and my corporate succession plans. I ensured the language was absolutely airtight, leaving no room for future appeals or probate litigation. He would not receive a single cent of the empire I had built with my bare hands. Next, we turned our full attention to Robert's shattered business. The 48-hour eviction had been flawlessly executed by the county sheriff, who had physically padlocked the massive commercial warehouse and barred all unauthorized entry. Because Robert was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing severe corporate embezzlement charges, his company completely defaulted on all remaining municipal agreements. I directed my blind trust to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on the property. We did not hold on to the asset out of spite or misplaced sentimentality. I wanted the physical manifestation of Robert's arrogance completely erased from my portfolio. Thomas quietly listed the sprawling distribution center on the open commercial market. Within 10 short days, we secured a highly lucrative cash offer from an aggressive out-of-state commercial developer who planned to demolish the old structure entirely. We finalized the sale and transferred the deed, permanently liquidating Robert's former kingdom and converting his monumental failure into clean, untethered capital. The purge was absolute, leaving zero loose ends for any opportunistic lawyer to challenge in the future. With the sweeping financial cleanup fully executed, I faced the critical task of redirecting the newly acquired capital. The state prosecutors had successfully recovered the stolen $47,000 during their forensic teardown of Robert's frozen shell accounts. When the federal authorities released those funds back into my primary holding account, alongside the massive multi-million-dollar sum generated from the rapid sale of Robert's former warehouse, I possessed a staggering amount of liquid cash. I flatly refused to let this money simply sit in a sterile investment portfolio, gathering meaningless interest. I needed to fundamentally transform the toxic capital they had tried to steal into an indestructible engine for generational progress. I instructed Thomas and Bradley to collaborate and establish a permanent, fully funded philanthropic trust. We purposefully bypassed the bloated bureaucratic charity organizations and created a direct, unassailable pipeline for real opportunity. I personally drafted the founding charter for a comprehensive full-ride logistics and business administration scholarship dedicated specifically to underprivileged Black youth residing in our city. I wanted to actively seek out the brilliant, hungry kids who possessed the exact same relentless drive and gritty determination I had 40 years ago, but severely lacked the financial runway to escape their current circumstances. The scholarship would cover full university tuition, housing stipends, textbooks, and provide guaranteed high-tier corporate internships within my national logistics network upon their graduation. I did not attach my own name to the trust. Instead, I named the foundational fund entirely after my late wife. I wanted her beautiful memory to stand as a towering beacon of genuine opportunity and hard-earned merit, fundamentally erasing the toxic culture of unearned entitlement and shallow privilege that Jordan had chosen to worship. By legally locking the capital into this specific charitable trust, I simultaneously achieved two permanent victories. I guaranteed that thousands of deserving young minds would receive a life-changing education, and I ensured that my son could never, under any legal circumstance, attempt to sue the estate for a piece of the fortune. The money was permanently out of his reach, working relentlessly to build up the exact working-class community he had so arrogantly despised. We finalized the incredibly dense trust documents late on a Friday evening. Thomas closed the heavy leather binder and pushed the finalized stack of notarized papers across the polished mahogany desk. He leaned back in his leather executive chair, quietly pouring 2 glasses of aged bourbon to mark the successful execution of the massive legal restructuring. He handed me a heavy crystal glass and studied my face with a quiet, analytical intensity. Thomas had been my legal shield and closest confidant for over 20 years, witnessing the brutal evolution of my corporate battles. But he knew this specific campaign had been intimately, agonizingly personal. He took a slow sip of his drink, the amber liquid catching the dim office light, and asked me the heavy question that had undoubtedly been weighing on his mind since the night the handcuffs clicked shut. He asked if cutting off my only son, permanently erasing my own flesh and blood from my legacy, and consigning him to federal prison caused me any lingering, insurmountable grief. I did not answer him immediately. I set the crystal glass down on the table and looked down at my own hands. I stared intently at the deep, permanent calluses, the jagged white scars, and the thick, weathered skin forged by 4 relentless decades of grueling physical labor and unforgiving corporate warfare. I looked back up at Thomas and met his gaze with absolute, unyielding clarity. I explained to him that a careful, experienced gardener does not shed foolish tears when he is forced to amputate a rotting, diseased branch. He executes the necessary cut with extreme, unsentimental prejudice, specifically to save the deep, vital roots of the entire tree from succumbing to the decay. Jordan had willingly allowed the rot of insatiable greed and superficial arrogance to completely infect his core, and I simply refused to let his terminal disease kill the legacy I had sacrificed my entire life to build. I had successfully excised the infection, secured my massive fortune, and perfectly insulated my life's work from parasitic consumption. My legacy was absolutely secure, armored in ironclad trusts, and protected by the law. However, the deep, reverberating echoes of the collapse were not entirely silent. As I left the towering glass office building and stepped out into the cool, dark evening air, my mobile phone suddenly vibrated in my inner coat pocket with a sharp, insistent rhythm. The bright digital screen illuminated the dark concrete sidewalk, displaying an incoming priority call from a highly restricted federal correctional facility. The final lingering encounter with the ghost of my past had arrived. The mobile phone vibrated in my palm, the bright digital screen displaying the sterile identification code of a federal penitentiary. Jordan was reaching out from the cold reality of his concrete cell, desperately seeking the very father he had attempted to erase. I did not answer the call. I did not decline it to send him instantly to voicemail. I simply pressed the power button, plunging the device into total, absolute darkness, and dropped it back into my heavy coat pocket. A dead branch requires absolutely no further attention once it has been severed from the trunk. 12 months passed with the rapid, unburdened efficiency of a perfectly balanced ledger. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had previously infected my home was entirely gone, replaced by a profound and restorative peace. I spent the year expanding the logistics scholarship alongside Thomas, personally mentoring the exceptionally driven students who utilized my late wife's fund to secure their futures. I watched them graduate, secure their first corporate contracts, and begin building their own generational wealth without a single ounce of toxic entitlement. My physical health perfectly mirrored my financial and emotional liberation. The chronic fatigue and phantom aches that Jordan had tried to weaponize as symptoms of dementia completely evaporated. I walked through the bustling downtown financial district on a brisk Tuesday afternoon, feeling sharper and more resilient than I had in 2 decades. I wore a tailored charcoal overcoat and polished leather Oxfords, moving with the steady, commanding stride of a man who owned his environment. The sky above the towering glass skyscrapers abruptly darkened, a heavy wall of bruised gray clouds rolling in from the east. A sudden torrential downpour unleashed over the city streets, sending pedestrians sprinting frantically for immediate cover. I did not run. I adjusted my collar against the freezing wind and stepped calmly through the glass door of a modest, dimly lit coffee shop tucked between 2 massive corporate banks. The interior smelled of burnt espresso and damp wool, a stark contrast to the sterile high-end environments I usually frequented. I bypassed the crowded front counter and walked directly to a quiet, isolated vinyl booth situated beside a rain-streaked window. I sat down, smoothing my coat, and looked out at the chaotic, flooded streets. I was perfectly content to wait out the storm in absolute silence. The coffee shop was severely understaffed, struggling to manage the sudden influx of rain-soaked customers seeking temporary refuge. A waitress emerged from the swinging kitchen doors, carrying a heavy plastic tray loaded with thick ceramic mugs. She moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy, her shoulders hunched forward in an attitude of permanent, exhausting defeat. She wore a faded brown apron, heavily stained with old coffee grounds and harsh industrial bleach. Her hair, stripped entirely of its expensive salon treatments, was pulled back into a messy frayed knot. Her hands, once adorned with expensive manicures and stolen jewelry, were now chapped and raw from constant exposure to industrial dish soap. She approached my isolated booth with her head down, hurriedly, pulling a crumpled notepad and a cheap plastic pen from her apron pocket. She did not offer a polite greeting or a manufactured customer service smile. She simply asked what I wanted to drink in a flat, monotonous voice completely drained of all vitality. I recognized the sharp, arrogant cadence buried beneath the exhaustion before I even saw her face. I remained perfectly still and looked up. Emily froze. The cheap plastic pen slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the scuffed linoleum floor. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening, translucent white. Her eyes widened in sheer paralyzing horror as she stared directly at the man she had viciously conspired to lock inside a psychiatric ward just 12 months ago. The crushing reality of our reversed positions hit her with the force of a physical blow. The last time we occupied the same room, she was dripping in diamonds, purchased with my stolen money, standing in my dining room, and demanding I surrender my entire life savings to her fraudulent husband. Now she was wearing a filthy uniform, working a grueling minimum wage shift to survive, while I sat before her in a tailored suit, projecting absolute unshakable wealth. The pristine, elitist social status she had wielded like a lethal weapon had been entirely eradicated. The federal authorities had systematically dismantled her father's bankrupt empire, and her husband was currently serving a decade in a federal penitentiary. Emily was completely destitute, stripped of her toxic arrogance, and forced to endure the exact working-class labor she had so openly despised. She opened her mouth, her jaw trembling violently, but her throat constricted in raw panic. She looked around the crowded diner, her chest heaving, absolutely terrified that I would publicly humiliate her or summon the manager to execute a final crushing blow to her fragile existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward across the table to deliver a vindictive lecture. Nor did I offer a single triumphant smile. A man of true power does not need to gloat over a defeated, insignificant enemy. I maintained my cold, glacial indifference, treating her with the exact same emotional detachment one might afford a broken piece of furniture. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and calmly ordered a single cup of black coffee. Emily swallowed hard, a visible shudder racking her thin frame. She nodded rapidly, her eyes brimming with humiliated tears, and practically sprinted away from the booth to fulfill the order. She returned 3 minutes later, her hands shaking so violently that the dark liquid nearly spilled over the rim of the thick ceramic mug. She placed it carefully on the table, terrified to make contact with my skin, and retreated instantly into the safety of the kitchen, without uttering a single syllable. I did not acknowledge her departure. I picked up the mug and drank the bitter coffee in absolute silence, watching the heavy rain streak across the window pane. I sat in the vinyl booth for 20 minutes, enjoying the profound, untouchable peace of my hard-earned reality. When I finished, the storm outside had broken the heavy gray clouds, parting to reveal a sharp, brilliant column of midday sunlight cutting through the gloom. I stood up and smoothed the front of my charcoal overcoat. I reached into my inner pocket and retrieved a sleek leather wallet. I did not ask for the bill. I pulled out a single crisp $100 note and placed it precisely in the center of the table. I took a silver pen from my breast pocket, retrieved the small paper receipt she had left near the napkin dispenser, and turned it over. I wrote a single perfectly legible sentence across the blank surface, setting the paper directly beside the $100 bill. I did not look toward the kitchen or seek out Emily's reaction as I turned and walked toward the glass exit. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the clean, rain-washed streets, stepping directly into the bright sunlight. Back inside the dim diner, Emily crept toward the empty vinyl booth with trembling hands. She stared at the crisp $100 bill, tears of absolute crushing defeat finally spilling over her cheeks as she read the words written in sharp black ink. Immediate family tips, well. The silent adjustment was complete, and the victory was permanent. The weeks following the arrests were a masterclass in aggressive corporate sanitation. I instructed Thomas to initiate a total financial purge, moving with ruthless efficiency to sever every remaining legal and financial tie to the parasites who had attempted to consume my life. The first order of business was the comprehensive rewriting of my last will and testament. I sat in Thomas's immaculate downtown office reviewing the thick, archaic estate plan I had drafted decades ago when Jordan was still a child. With a few decisive strokes of a heavy fountain pen, I completely and irrevocably disinherited him. I legally excised his name from my blind trusts, my international life insurance policies, my real estate holdings, and my corporate succession plans. I ensured the language was absolutely airtight, leaving no room for future appeals or probate litigation. He would not receive a single cent of the empire I had built with my bare hands. Next, we turned our full attention to Robert's shattered business. The 48-hour eviction had been flawlessly executed by the county sheriff, who had physically padlocked the massive commercial warehouse and barred all unauthorized entry. Because Robert was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing severe corporate embezzlement charges, his company completely defaulted on all remaining municipal agreements. I directed my blind trust to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on the property. We did not hold on to the asset out of spite or misplaced sentimentality. I wanted the physical manifestation of Robert's arrogance completely erased from my portfolio. Thomas quietly listed the sprawling distribution center on the open commercial market. Within 10 short days, we secured a highly lucrative cash offer from an aggressive out-of-state commercial developer who planned to demolish the old structure entirely. We finalized the sale and transferred the deed, permanently liquidating Robert's former kingdom and converting his monumental failure into clean, untethered capital. The purge was absolute, leaving zero loose ends for any opportunistic lawyer to challenge in the future. I watched the final digital transfers clear my encrypted banking portal. The satisfaction was purely clinical. My assets were completely locked behind a fortress of impenetrable corporate law. With the sweeping financial cleanup fully executed, I faced the critical task of redirecting the newly acquired capital. The state prosecutors had successfully recovered the stolen $47,000 during their forensic teardown of Robert's frozen shell accounts. When the federal authorities released those funds back into my primary holding account, alongside the massive multi-million-dollar sum generated from the rapid sale of Robert's former warehouse, I possessed a staggering amount of liquid cash. I flatly refused to let this money simply sit in a sterile investment portfolio gathering meaningless interest. I needed to fundamentally transform the toxic capital they had tried to steal into an indestructible engine for generational progress. I instructed Thomas and Bradley to collaborate and establish a permanent, fully funded philanthropic trust. We purposefully bypassed the bloated bureaucratic charity organizations and created a direct, unassailable pipeline for real opportunity. I personally drafted the founding charter for a comprehensive full-ride logistics and business administration. Scholarship. Dedicated specifically to underprivileged Black youth residing in our city. I wanted to actively seek out the brilliant, hungry kids who possessed the exact same relentless drive and gritty determination I had 40 years ago, but severely lacked the financial runway to escape their current circumstances. The scholarship would cover full university tuition, housing stipends, textbooks, and provide guaranteed high-tier corporate internships within my national logistics network upon their graduation. I did not attach my own name to the trust. Instead, I named the foundational fund entirely after my late wife. I wanted her beautiful memory to stand as a towering beacon of genuine opportunity and hard-earned merit, fundamentally erasing the toxic culture of unearned entitlement and shallow privilege that Jordan had chosen to worship. By legally locking the capital into this specific charitable trust, I simultaneously achieved two permanent victories. I guaranteed that thousands of deserving young minds would receive a life-changing education, and I ensured that my son could never, under any legal circumstance, attempt to sue the estate for a piece of the fortune. The money was permanently out of his reach, working relentlessly to build up the exact working-class community he had so arrogantly despised. Every single dollar that Robert and Jordan had desperately tried to siphon away to fund their country club illusions was now aggressively deployed to shatter the very systemic barriers they had used to exclude others. The paperwork was finalized, the endowment was permanently locked, and the first wave of scholarship applications was officially distributed to local high schools. The legacy of my wealth was finally completely secure. We finalized the incredibly dense trust documents late on a Friday evening. Thomas closed the heavy leather binder and pushed the finalized stack of notarized papers across the polished mahogany desk. He leaned back in his leather executive chair, quietly pouring 2 glasses of aged bourbon to mark the successful execution of the massive legal restructuring. He handed me a heavy crystal glass and studied my face with a quiet, analytical intensity. Thomas had been my legal shield and closest confidant for over 20 years, witnessing the brutal evolution of my corporate battles. But he knew this specific campaign had been intimately, agonizingly personal. He took a slow sip of his drink, the amber liquid catching the dim office light, and asked me the heavy question that had undoubtedly been weighing on his mind since the night the handcuffs clicked shut. He asked if cutting off my only son, permanently erasing my own flesh and blood from my legacy, and consigning him to federal prison, caused me any lingering, insurmountable grief. I did not answer him immediately. I set the crystal glass down on the table and looked down at my own hands. I stared intently at the deep, permanent calluses, the jagged white scars, and the thick, weathered skin forged by 4 relentless decades of grueling physical labor and unforgiving corporate warfare. I looked back up at Thomas and met his gaze with absolute, unyielding clarity. I explained to him that a careful, experienced gardener does not shed foolish tears when he is forced to amputate a rotting, diseased branch. He executes the necessary cut with extreme unsentimental prejudice specifically to save the deep, vital roots of the entire tree from succumbing to the decay. Jordan had willingly allowed the rot of insatiable greed and superficial arrogance to completely infect his core, and I simply refused to let his terminal disease kill the legacy I had sacrificed my entire life to build. I had successfully excised the infection, secured my massive fortune, and perfectly insulated my life's work from parasitic consumption. My legacy was absolutely secure, armored in ironclad trusts, and protected by the law. However, the deep reverberating echoes of the collapse were not entirely silent. As I left the towering glass office building and stepped out into the cool, dark evening air, my mobile phone suddenly vibrated in my inner coat pocket with a sharp, insistent rhythm. The bright digital screen illuminated the dark concrete sidewalk, displaying an incoming priority call from a highly restricted federal correctional facility. The final lingering encounter with the ghost of my past had arrived. This ordeal illuminated a brutal but necessary truth about human relationships and inherited wealth. True respect cannot be purchased, and genuine loyalty cannot be demanded through financial obligation. When you shield your loved ones from the grueling consequences of failure, you do not protect them. You merely corrupt their character and foster an insatiable entitlement. Wealth should function as a tool to amplify hard-earned merit, never as a blind safety net for arrogant incompetence. Sometimes the most profound act of love is allowing a toxic branch to fall, ensuring the roots of your legacy remain permanently strong and completely untainted. Share your thoughts on James's ultimate decision in the comments below, and subscribe to hear how this intense family drama finally concludes.